Howdy, and thank you for joining me on this lesson in education. Today we're going to be looking at what is the role of culture in education and how we might be able to utilize that to better understand our students and develop more effective classroom management practices. So first we must understand, what is culture? Culture is the knowledge, values, attitudes, and traditions that guide the behaviors of a group of people and allow them to solve the problems in their community. So, if we understand what the definition of culture is, what role does culture play in education and how does that influence education? We can look at how it influences development of students and children in general. We can look at how it develops learning abilities and learning styles in students, and how we can possibly use culture to motivate students as well. So starting with development, we can look at how social development in children is influenced by culture. Culture is a major component of what constitutes societal norms, and children develop and understand how to behave in society, with culture being a major influence in that. So that's saying that our culture is telling us what is acceptable, unacceptable, and we learn those kinds of things from our parents, our family, friends, and other people within our culture. And as a continuation of social development and society, our moral reasoning is a product of what we learn from our society and from our culture. By definition here, our moral values are influenced by socially agreed upon standards. So our society is what deems what is morally correct or incorrect. And that's going to influence what our moral values are as an individual. And morals are not standard. They can differ greatly from one culture to another. And that can come down to religion or religious beliefs or other cultural standards. I decided to create this graphic here, and though it shows what looks like a linear progression, I would like to consider it more as a compounding upon each component here. So we have culture, which influences our society and our social development, and our social standards are what's influencing our morals and moral reasoning. So I like to represent that in this graphic here, where culture shows the influence each one, where you're not necessarily starting from one to the other, but more as a building upon each component. As we've seen, a student's culture has an impact on their social and moral development. Additionally, a student's culture can influence how a student learns and how they interact in their classroom environment. We can first look at how student behavior can be influenced by culture. It's important to understand classroom behaviors and the cultures of our students, because in some cases, what is deemed acceptable behavior in some cultures may be deemed unacceptable behavior to the teacher or in the classroom environment. And that's important to distinguish, where instead of disciplining the student for their behavior, it's where you could possibly redirect that behavior in a more productive manner or in a more positive direction. It's also important to understand student culture when looking for ways to reinforce positive classroom behavior. If you understand a student's culture, it may give you a better idea of things you can do in the classroom that students would enjoy to reinforce the behavior you're looking for. Another way that student culture can influence their learning is it can influence their learning style. You have things such as auditory, visual, global, and analytic. Let's take a look at a few examples. In our first example, we have a study that was done that looked at the learning styles of Native American students. And what they found was students of Native American cultures are generally more global and observational learners than other cultures. And what that means is that Native American students usually require an overall picture when learning a new task versus someone that's an analytic learner, which is a step-by-step learning style. Additionally, they are observational learners in that they learn better when they first see somebody doing a task and then repeating it themselves rather than just being told how to complete a task. And our next example is actually a personal example. A large majority of my family and family friends are farmers, ranchers, and gardeners, and that brought me up to be a hands-on and observational learner, where I learn best after seeing somebody complete a task and doing it myself rather than someone just telling me how to complete a task. In both of these examples, we could see how culture influenced how a person learns and how that might possibly impact how they learn in a classroom environment. So now let's see how we could possibly use culture to motivate students in a classroom environment. When we look how culture can motivate students in the classroom, we can start off with things such as interest. We're all more motivated when we're interested in a subject. So by integrating a student's interest and culture into the lesson could be a way to get them interested in the subject. An example of using cultural interest to motivate students could be using something like football information in relation to the lesson to interest students in a small Texas town where football is a very popular sport. Next, we can look at goals. While usually goals are more specific to a person, there are times where we can use cultural goals to influence students' learning. Lastly, we can look at how beliefs can affect motivation in students. There are times in some cultures where there are cultural stigmas that influence belief and self-efficacy, whether it be race, financial standing, or social class. There are times where students believe that they are not as able to learn or not as effective learners as other students of other races, financial standings, or social classes. And this is where we need to motivate students and show that they are just as capable of learning and being successful as other students in different cultures, social classes, and financial standings. On this note, it's a good time to put out a word of caution. It's important for the educator to not culturally stereotype their students and to treat their students on an individual basis and not assume the best way that they learn based on their culture, ethnicity, race, social standing, or financial situation. Now that we've learned how culture influences student development, learning, and motivation, let's look at a few ways that we can utilize culture in the classroom. A good resource to check out when trying to integrate multicultural education into the classroom is Banks' Dimension of Multicultural Learning, which states there are 5 dimensions to multicultural education, which is equity pedagogy, content integration, prejudice reduction, empowering culture, and knowledge construction. Equity pedagogy is simply matching your style of teaching to the student's style of learning. Content integration is looking to integrate as many different examples of different cultures into content and into lessons to give students a broader range of cultures they may have not experienced before. Prejudice reduction is looking to reduce the prejudices that students may hold and to give them an education to understand better the people around them. Empowering culture is looking to create a school and social culture that empowers all students across different groups. And lastly, knowledge construction seeks to teach students that cultural assumptions can influence the way knowledge is constructed within different disciplines. The next, and in my opinion, the most important way a teacher can understand culture in their classroom is get to know their students on an individual basis. If you take the time to understand your students and know what cultures they come from, it lets you understand how you can integrate the cultures that students have into the classroom and possibly introduce new cultures to students of different backgrounds. And with that, that's going to conclude our lesson. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, learned something new along the way, and I thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery into the role of culture in education.